Here's a guy who thinks Noah's flood actually happened.
Inevitable China. What's up?
Hi.
Hey.
Yeah, I had a question. So do you believe a literal flood of the entire planet occurred as depicted in the Bible? And if so, why?
Have you read the ancient Chinese accounts of it?
No, I have not. When do they depict these floods of having happened?
How would there be Chinese accounts of it? Were there Chinese survivors? Were these accounts written in Chinese?
Well, they don't give a date, but like ancient Chinese mythology talks about it. So does the Enuma Elish. These kinds of ancient documents talk about it. So
yeah, lots of cultures have flood myths. That's hardly evidence of an actual flood, let alone a global one.
I accept it because it's in the scriptures. It's divinely revealed.
Oh, well, case closed then.
In the beginning of the Xia dynasty, there were tales of the Yangtze River flooding, and there were foundational, members of the first dynasty that were tasked with redirecting the flow of the navigation of the rivers. But of course, in the biblical depiction, what we understand is that the entire planet flooded, and everybody that didn't join Noah in their ark were not able to survive. So I wanted to ask if you believe in that specific story.
I do. I believe the story of Noah. Yes.
Why, though? Why is it that the flood story doesn't line up with the archaeological, geological, or biological evidence? Why does the archaeological evidence show no cultural interruption consistent with every culture on the planet suddenly being wiped out? Why does the geological evidence show no sign of a global flood in the growth of coral reefs or in ice cores? Why does the biological evidence contradict the possibility of a global flood? Why do we see none of the genetic bottlenecks that would result from thousands of species each descending from only 2 flood survivors? And why do freshwater fish still exist? If the oceans poured into the riverbeds, it would have killed off all of the freshwater fish.
So in that basis, right, so you're saying that you believe this because this occurred, or this was written in the scriptures.
The flood myth he just looked up doesn't even match the flood myth from the Bible. The Wikipedia article says that people were said to be able to get away from it by going to high ground. That's not a global flood. That's not a flood that covers the entire surface of the earth.
I'm just trying to remember what I was thinking of. What I'm thinking of is called the Chinese Gunyu myth. Have you heard that?
Yeah.
It says it lasted for 2 generations.
It says allegedly, and a flood that lasted 2 generations isn't at all consistent with the biblical flood myth because Genesis chapter 8 says that the earth was dry after only about a year.
So it doesn't say anything about like it just being a couple rivers.
It also doesn't say anything about it being global. In fact, because it says that people were able to escape to the hills and mountains, this alleged flood was explicitly not global. If people were able to survive in the mountains, the flood would not have covered the entire surface of the globe.
Well, that's a separate myth too. I wouldn't necessarily say that that's all one and the same. But as far as the Gunyu myth, right, I still wouldn't corroborate with the biblical flood, biblical flood story.
Because it's a myth, and myths can't corroborate anything. Even if it were not a myth, it wouldn't corroborate the occurrence of a global flood because it explicitly wasn't global. And the Bible's flood only lasted a little over a year, while the alleged Chinese flood lasted 2 generations.
So I guess that
why would it not?
Well, because everybody that was not on Noah's Ark would have died, right? So the people who witnessed the Gunyu myth, for example, would not be able to live to tell the tale.
No, if the flood happened, then the people in China are the descendants of Noah's children. So that's how that happened.
That's not what the Chinese myth says. Further down in the article, it says, during the course of fighting, surviving, and eventually getting the inundation problems under control, much progress was also made in terms of land management, beast control, and agricultural techniques. According to the myth, there were survivors. The reason it's called the Gunyu myth is because it tells of a guy named Gun who tried to stop the spread of the flood using a magical soil, and his son Yu, who is credited with having successfully contained it. It also says that this took years to do. This is not consistent with the idea that everyone in China died from a flood that was gone after about a year, and then years later some descendants of Noah made their way there.
But is that what is stated to be the case in the Gunyu myth? Is that what they say? Do they say that they are descendants of Noah?
This myth also differs from the Sumerian, Akkadian flood stories as well. So the argument is not that the details of all the stories are accurate, it's that there is a primordial myth that's in all of these traditions about a global flood.
But this myth is not about a global flood. It is explicitly not global. It says there were survivors in China, not survivors that came from the Middle East, and if all of the cultures of the world had been wiped out, you would expect that their cultural practices would have stopped too. But I guess we're to believe that when Noah's descendants got to the various regions of the earth, they picked up all of their cultures exactly where they left off.
Now look at the Egyptians. They feature prominently in the Bible, yet they were already writing in hieroglyphs hundreds of years before the flood, back when Noah's ancestors were still writing in pictographs. If there had been a global flood, that practice would have stopped abruptly in 2340 BCE and wouldn't be picked up again. Yet, hieroglyphs continued, just like Egypt continued, for thousands of years, all the way to the closing of the pagan temples in the 5th century of the Common Era. So there was never a time when Egypt was flooded.
This is also hard to square with the Tower of Babel story. How did the Egyptian language continue if everyone started speaking new languages? Or was Egyptian the original language and a few people were able to stick with it somehow?
Wouldn't this be because floods just happen in regions? Like, even
Yeah, well,
it was the Sumerian region in which the biblical flood is alleged to have come from.
right. I mean, you're right
that's
that
just
yeah, you're right that it depends on the worldview as to whether or not it's a global flood or not.
Why did the descendants of Noah have such a different worldview from their ancestors that they denied that the flood was global? And given that these different flood myths often do not depict a global flood, that undermines your assertion that all these cultures have stories about a global flood.
So yeah, there are floods everywhere, so there could be. But so that's when it comes back down to what we accept as our final authority. So what do you accept as your final epistemic authority?
If, at the end of the day, the only evidence that matters is the Bible, what is even the point of bringing up these other flood myths?
Oh, I'm trying to wrap my head around the belief in the flood as far as like why even say a Christian would believe in it, just because of the complete lack of evidence,
But again, you're saying the lack of evidence, and I'm giving you Epic of Gilgamesh, Gunyu, all of these different global flood myths of the ancient world.
The Gunyu myth is not about a global flood. When it was pointed out to you that a lot of these flood myths are not global, you said that this is because of different worldviews, pivoted to saying that the Bible is the only ultimate epistemic authority, and now you're back to saying that these are global flood myths, at least some of which explicitly are not.
Would count as forms of evidence, but you're saying no, they don't, because why?
The Gunyu myth is not evidence of a global flood because it describes an explicitly non-global flood.
Well, these are stories of floods, and these are widely acknowledged as myths, even within their own contemporary culture.
Oh, okay.
So you are saying that the flood in the Bible legitimately occurred.
Right. So now you're saying that we can't accept what is now mythology, because the argument wasn't that it's true because it's a myth. The argument was that this counts as a form of data because all of these different cultures have a similar root story. That was the argument.
And one of the rebuttals was that lots of cultures have a similar root story about a flood because most cultures have experienced local floods. Given how common local floods are, why is that not a more probable explanation?
And I'm saying that's a corroborating piece of evidence. But you're saying it doesn't prove the flood because you have a commitment to what, reason and evidence? Is that what you're saying?
And reason and evidence comes from God, therefore you have to accept the Bible if you want to accept reason and evidence, right? Look, even if there were a God that made reason and evidence the basis of discerning truth, it wouldn't follow that the Bible is therefore correct. In fact, reason and evidence shows the Bible to be consistently incorrect, so even if God invented reason, we have to conclude that the Bible does not accurately portray whatever God exists.
So I'm saying that these are data points, but these aren't necessarily data points that would contribute to the validating a flood story of the Bible, right?
But why?
A global worldwide flood is not the same as a regional flood.
Well, these don't all say that they don't all. You're just saying they're
Okay.
regional. They don't actually say that they're specifically all regional. You're saying no, they're just regional.
Some of them do say that they're regional. How do you figure that the explicitly regional flood myths are evidence of a global flood?
Well, yes, most of these flood stories are based off of regional floods, right? So these, even the Gunyu myth is referring specifically to a flooding of
You're
rivers.
saying that, but where does it specifically say, oh no, this is only a myth for our region?
The Gunyu myth explicitly says that several people survived, and survived in China, which would require the flood to not cover the entire planet. This guy seems to be making his argument non-falsifiable. Whenever a flood myth has something in common with the biblical flood, it's corroborating evidence. But when it doesn't match up or outright contradicts the biblical flood myth, that doesn't count as evidence to the contrary. How convenient.
Well, I mean, again, right, this is referring to Yu the Great. The Gunyu myth is literally about the foundations of China and what was done in order to tame the waters that sparks the Gunyu flood myth in the first place.
Okay.
So it doesn't, the fact that it doesn't say, hey, the entire planet flooded is probably fair enough to say that, hey, this is about a regional and national
Okay,
myth.
well, then that's an argument from silence. And so that doesn't prove or disprove anything.
You're making an argument from silence. You're the one saying the myth doesn't say the flood was only regional, as though you can then safely assume it was global. The Wikipedia article you looked up says the myth talked about population displacements. Whither were these populations displaced if there was no dry land left? And it's not an argument from silence to restrict your inferences to only what the myth does say. It's just using Occam's razor. If a story talks about a flood, you're not applying Occam's razor if you assume the flood was global just because it doesn't say it was not global.
So you're just saying that, yeah, well, but if it's an argument from silence, it proves my view.
That's not what he's arguing. He's not saying it proves his view. He's saying that it fails to prove your view. Again, you're the one saying that flood myths that aren't explicitly regional are evidence of a flood that was global. That is an argument from silence.
So that's inconclusive. So what's at work here is rival commitments to ultimate authorities. And so let's say the flood is false and the Bible is incorrect. What's the correct view?
That there was no global flood.
Well, the problem is, I guess the problem is the faulty logic in being able to use data points and assert that these are tangible, reasonable data points, right? I think there has to be a level of reason and, appropriation towards the overall thesis that you're trying to
Correct.
make. Correct.
And so so in your worldview then, since you're relying on reasoning ultimately, what is reason in your worldview?
I figured this would devolve into presuppositionalism eventually. Presuppositional apologists, when you show their evidence to be faulty, will fall back on saying that to even reason based on evidence requires God to make reason exist. They think that if God didn't make reason, then contradictions could be true and tautologies could be false. They think the default state of reality is chaos, and that order, even logic, can only exist if it is imposed upon reality by a conscious mind. This is a baseless assumption.
And logic.
Here's my point, right? So, for example,
what is reason and logic, since it's your final commitment?
For me, it's not a commitment. A commitment is a choice. I believe in the laws of logic because I can't help but believe in them. I can't understand what it would even mean for them to be false. I'm not saying that this makes them true. I'm saying that I can't help but believe they're true, even if they are somehow false. I don't see this as requiring a God because I can't rule out the idea that reality is ultimately incomprehensible. So I have no reason to believe that a God has made it comprehensible. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.